7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
A group of archaeologists have resumed the search for the 2,000-year-old Dead Sea Scroll.
What if I told you that somewhere in a vault in Jerusalem there sat a lump of charcoal for 40 years, and inside that blackened mass was a message that would shake everything we thought we knew about ancient texts?
This is the oldest Hebrew inscription ever found. It is 3,000 years old, from the time of King David.
This isn't science fiction. This is the story of the En-Gedi scroll, a Torah manuscript so badly burned that it turned to powder at the slightest touch. Yet somehow, against all odds, it spoke again, and when it finally revealed its secrets, scholars couldn't believe what they were reading. The fire that tried to erase history. May 1970. Archaeologists stepped carefully through the ruins of an ancient synagogue on the western shore of the Dead Sea. The place is En-Gedi, once a lush oasis of palm trees, freshwater springs, and immense wealth. In antiquity, En-Gedi was famous for something so valuable that the community carved a warning directly into their synagogue floor: tell no one. The secret was almost certainly balsam oil, a rare perfume and medicinal substance prized across the Roman world. Writers like Josephus described En-Gedi as a place where the air itself smelled of fortune. By the time archaeologists arrived, the prosperity was long gone. What remained were shattered stone walls outlining a grand prayer hall and fragments of a colorful mosaic floor inscribed in Hebrew and Aramaic. Names of donors appeared alongside that chilling warning about secrecy. For centuries, this synagogue had been the heart of a Jewish community where families gathered for Sabbath prayers, where Torah was read aloud, and where identity was preserved through Roman, Byzantine, and shifting imperial rule. The building itself told a story of growth and devotion. What began as a simple hall evolved into an impressive basilica-style structure with ornate mosaics, a raised reading platform, and a sacred niche built into the western wall. That niche was the Holy Ark, the most important place in the synagogue where Torah scrolls were stored and revered. When archaeologists opened the Ark, they did not find neatly rolled manuscripts. They found what looked like burned firewood. Inside were several blackened lumps, crushed and oddly glossy from intense heat. They were fragile beyond belief. When touched, tiny flakes broke away and drifted downward like dark snow. Even breathing nearby felt dangerous. Yet the shapes were unmistakable. These were not random debris. The tight coils, the layered structure, the deliberate placement, everything pointed to one conclusion. These were Torah scrolls, handwritten copies of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Texts once read aloud to the people of En-Gedi during prayer, now reduced to carbon. The synagogue dated back to the 3rd century CE and remained active for hundreds of years until catastrophe struck in the 6th or early 7th century. Evidence of violence was everywhere: collapsed roofing, charred beams, thick ash covering the floor. Who caused the destruction remains debated. Some scholars point to the Byzantine Emperor Justinian's persecution of Jewish communities. Others suggest a Bedouin raid shortly before the Persian invasion. Whoever was responsible, the fire was intense enough to reach the Ark and subject the scrolls to extreme heat. Animal skin, ink, and parchment collapsed inward, fusing into a brittle, unreadable mass. The archaeologists faced a devastating dilemma. In 1970, conservation science simply wasn't advanced enough to handle something this fragile. Cutting the scroll open or peeling it by hand would almost certainly destroy whatever text remained. But leaving it sealed meant accepting that its words might never be known. Knowledge was there, trapped but unreachable. After long deliberation, they made a radical decision: preserve the object, not the information. The largest burned scroll was carefully stabilized, lifted, and sent to the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem. It was cataloged, sealed in a climate-controlled vault, and left untouched. A silent relic, a book no one could read. Why did it matter so much? To understand that, you have to look north about 20 miles to the cliffs of Qumran.
Archaeologists hope to excavate hundreds of caves along the shore of the Dead Sea.
In the late 1942, Bedouin shepherds accidentally discovered clay jars hidden in desert caves. Inside were ancient manuscripts that would become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Written between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, they included the oldest copies of biblical texts ever found. When scholars examined them, they noticed something shocking. The texts were not identical. Some matched the version that would later become the standard Jewish Bible. Others aligned with the Greek Septuagint used by early Christians. Still others resembled the Samaritan Torah. The Dead Sea Scrolls revealed that during the Second Temple period, multiple versions of sacred scripture circulated simultaneously. Scripture had not yet fully standardized. This made the En-Gedi scroll extraordinary. Here was a Torah scroll from centuries later, preserved in a village synagogue, potentially bridging the gap between the diverse biblical traditions of antiquity and the highly standardized texts of the medieval period. It could reveal when and how the biblical text became fixed. It could confirm continuity or expose change. But there was just one problem. No one could read it, and so the scroll waited. For more than 40 years, it sat in darkness, inside a box, inside a vault, occasionally checked for stability, never opened, never examined, a symbol of lost knowledge history present but inaccessible, a voice sealed by fire, waiting for a future technology bold enough to listen. What the flames tried to erase, time had merely delayed. When technology refused to give up, the scroll became a symbol of tantalizing mystery, a treasure that existed but couldn't be accessed, knowledge present but forever out of reach. That quiet frustration finally shifted in the early 21st century when imaging specialists and computer scientists started asking a bold, almost absurd question. Instead of cutting fragile scrolls open with blades and risking destruction, could they somehow look through them from the outside? Hospitals had used scanning machines for decades to look inside the human body without surgery. Scientists wondered if the same idea could work on a burned scroll. To test it, they turned to a micro-CT scanner. A normal CT scan is the X-ray machine doctors use to see inside a patient's chest or head, taking many thin images from different angles that a computer stacks together into a three-dimensional model. A micro-CT scanner works the same way but is tuned for small, solid objects instead of living tissue.
Today we will show you a little bit about micro-CT scanning. So CT scanning is the newest addition to our laboratory.
Capturing incredibly fine details and detecting subtle density changes inside material. The team placed the En-Gedi scroll inside this scanner. The machine sent a powerful X-ray beam through the scroll as it slowly rotated. Each time it turned slightly, the scanner recorded another thin cross-sectional slice. When finished, the computer held a massive three-dimensional data block representing the complete interior structure, layer by layer, millimeter by millimeter. The scientists had no idea if any ink would show up. At first, they had only a cloud of grayscale tones representing different material densities inside the charred lump. When they examined the scan more carefully and adjusted the contrast, something extraordinary appeared. Inside the gray parchment shape were brighter streaks that looked distinctly different. The parchment absorbed some X-rays. Empty air absorbed even less. But the ancient ink, containing heavier metal elements, absorbed significantly more. That difference showed up as thicker, brighter lines in the scan. For the first time in modern history, they could see the scroll still held visible ink strokes trapped inside its carbonized shell. There really was a hidden text waiting, a message that had survived fire, time, and decay. The challenge shifted from conservators to computer scientists. The massive scan file went to William Brent Seals and his research group at the University of Kentucky, a team that had spent years developing methods to recover writing from damaged manuscripts using computers. Seals's goal was simple to state, but brutally difficult to achieve. Do inside the computer what no one could risk in real life. Find each layer of the tightly wound scroll, treat those layers as pages, virtually flatten them, and display any ink strokes in correct reading order, as if the scroll had never burned. The first major problem was understanding the precise, three-dimensional shape of the scroll layers. To humans, the scan looked like chaotic, curved, and folded surfaces pressed together and warped by fire. The computer had to figure out where one parchment layer ended and the next began. The team wrote sophisticated software that could trace the path of a single thin sheet through the three-dimensional data block, like drawing lines around each layer of an onion. In technical terms, it's called segmentation. In plain language, the computer learns to follow one individual parchment sheet at a time as it twists, curves, and winds through the scroll's interior. This wasn't easy. The synagogue fire had severely warped the structure. In some places, layers fused together. In others, there were bubbles, gaps, or complex folds. The software had to handle overlapping layers, microscopic cracks, and areas where it wasn't clear if the material was parchment, ash, or something else. The team fine-tuned their algorithms so the virtual surface they traced stayed faithfully close to real parchment and didn't accidentally jump between layers. This careful, patient tracing was the foundation for everything that followed. Once the software mapped out a single layer, the next step was applying correct visual information to that virtual surface. The micro-CT scan contained density information at every point. Some spots showed parchment, some showed air, some showed ink. The team wrote code that identified darker, denser spots corresponding to ink and mapped that pattern onto the virtual parchment layer they'd traced. This step, called texturing, transforms raw scan data into a realistic image of what that layer would look like if you could peel it out and stretch it flat. Of course, each parchment layer is curved and wrapped around itself multiple times. You can't see it all at once unless you flatten it. So the team added a final crucial step. They took each traced and textured layer and used mathematical transformations to digitally flatten it, like pressing a crumpled sheet smooth. Then they stitched those flattened pieces together at the edges. When complete, the computer could display a single flat image representing one complete wrap of the scroll, showing text no human eye had seen in nearly 2,000 years. The moment the silence broke, with the En-Gedi scroll, the process worked so well that the team was able to recover clear, readable text from 5 complete wraps of the animal skin. The final flattened images showed 2 side-by-side columns of writing, exactly as they would have appeared when the scroll was new. In total, they recovered 35 lines of ancient Hebrew script.
Persian and Arabic characters, Arabic in Arabic characters, and Judeo-Arabic, which means Arabic written in Hebrew characters.
Each line contained approximately 33 or 34 letters. The individual letters themselves were tiny, less than 1/10 of an inch tall, yet they appeared as sharp, crisp shapes on the computer screen. Some lines were perfectly complete, others were broken where the parchment had cracked over the centuries, but enough text survived that the words were entirely readable. To make this possible, the team employed artificial intelligence tools to detect subtle patterns in the writing. The AI software learned to distinguish between random noise and degradation in the scan data and the specific shapes and textures that corresponded to genuine ink strokes. That kind of intelligent pattern recognition made even very faint traces of writing stand out more clearly, especially in places where the ink signal was weak or blurred by fire damage. The most powerful moment in the entire project came when all these technological steps finally came together. After years of the scroll being thought of as nothing more than a dead, unreadable object, the researchers finally had a clear, flat image of one complete wrap of the scroll displayed on their computer screens. Instead of a black, useless mass of charcoal, they were looking at neat horizontal lines of ancient Hebrew letters, crisp and legible. Once they had generated those high-resolution master images, the computer scientists sent the pictures back to the biblical scholars and Dead Sea Scrolls experts in charge of the collection. Now those scholars could finally do what they do best. They could study the recovered text letter by letter and line by line, slowly working out what the ancient scribe had written 2 millennia ago. And when they did, what they discovered shocked them, because the message inside this once silent scroll was not what many of them had expected to see at all. When that blackened lump from En-Gedi finally gave up its secrets, the first clear words that appeared were not a strange hymn, not a lost prayer, not some wild new prophecy or apocalyptic vision. They were instructions, very old and very precise instructions about how to bring sacrificial animals and grain offerings to the altar in the ancient temple.
Kailasha Temple is part of a complex of cave temples that are found.
The charred scroll from the burned synagogue ark turned out to contain the opening chapters of the book of Leviticus, the 3rd book of the Torah, written in classical ancient Hebrew. Leviticus is famously the book that most modern readers tend to skip. It opens with detailed rules for burnt offerings and grain offerings, with step-by-step instructions about how a worshiper brings a bull, a sheep, or a bird to the priests, how the priest handles the animal's blood, and exactly how flour mixed with oil should be laid on the altar. The En-Gedi scroll preserved parts of those opening ritual instructions. The readable lines covered the beginning of chapter 1 and part of chapter 2 of Leviticus. There are no chapter numbers on the scroll itself, no verse numbers, no punctuation marks, and critically, no vowel signs. The words run in a continuous chain of consonant letters, exactly the way Torah scrolls looked in late antiquity. Those missing vowel markings are actually a quiet clue to the scroll's age. The small dots and dashes that indicate how to pronounce the vowels in Hebrew were added to written texts much later, around the early Middle Ages, as part of a standardization effort by Jewish scribes called the Masoretes. Before that system was developed, readers learned the correct pronunciation through memory and oral tradition passed down through generations. So a scroll that has only consonants and no vowel marks is almost certainly older than the 9th century CE, even before anyone performed scientific dating tests. When scientists did eventually test the scroll, they treated a tiny sample of the charred material and measured how much of a specific isotope of carbon remained in it, using a technique called radiocarbon dating. The test, performed at the Weizmann Institute in Israel, pointed to a date somewhere between the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era. Handwriting experts then examined the shapes and styles of the individual letters, comparing them to Hebrew scripts from different time periods. One leading paleography expert, Ada Yardeni, argued that the letter forms looked even earlier, more consistent with scripts from the second half of the 1st century CE or the beginning of the 2nd century. Another scholar, Drew Longacre, pushed back on that assessment, suggesting that once you account for gaps in the available samples of later handwriting styles, the letter shapes could still fit comfortably within the radiocarbon date range of the 3rd or 4th century. So there's a range of possible dates rather than a single definitive year, but everyone agrees on the fundamental picture. This scroll was copied many centuries before the classic medieval Torah manuscripts that most printed Hebrew Bibles are based on today, and only a few centuries after the last of the famous Dead Sea Scrolls were written and hidden in caves. The discovery that rewrote the rules. The En-Gedi scroll sits in a critical gap in the historical record, a period where almost no complete Torah scrolls had survived. Before this burned scroll spoke, biblical scholars had developed a working hypothesis. The Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran had already shown that in the last centuries before the Jerusalem Temple fell in 70 CE, several slightly different textual traditions of the Hebrew Bible circulated simultaneously. Some copies aligned with what became the standard Jewish text. Others leaned toward the ancient Greek Septuagint used by early Christians. Still others showed affinity to the Samaritan Pentateuch. Some even mixed features from multiple traditions. Because of that textual diversity, many experts expected a Leviticus scroll from the first few centuries. CE wouldn't match a modern Hebrew Bible word for word. They anticipated at least some textual variants. Maybe a few lines would be shorter or longer. Perhaps phrases would appear in different sequences, or we'd see mixed characteristics from different text families. The discovery from Engedi dropped right into that expectation and did something completely unexpected. Once the letters were crystal clear on screens, the research team handed the recovered text to leading Hebrew Bible experts. Emmanuel Tov and his colleagues laid the newly revealed lines from the En-Gedi scroll next to the standard medieval Hebrew text of Leviticus, the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is the main traditional Hebrew Bible text used in Jewish communities for centuries, the version that became the foundation for virtually all modern translations. What they found stunned even those who already believed the biblical text was relatively stable. Line after line matched perfectly. For every part that survived the fire, the En-Gedi scroll is completely identical to the medieval Masoretic text in its letters, word choices, and even paragraph breaks and spacing. Not just close, not almost the same, but absolutely matching. The charred scroll even reproduces the exact same places where the traditional text leaves small gaps to mark new thematic sections, precisely matching the layout in the Aleppo Codex, one of the most important medieval Masoretic manuscripts. For this portion of Leviticus, the biblical text appears to have been locked in place and transmitted with extraordinary fidelity much earlier than scholars had estimated. The implications are profound. By the 3rd or 4th century CE, possibly even earlier, there was already a highly standardized version of at least this biblical book in use in Jewish communities, copied with meticulous care and consistency. The textual plurality visible in the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Second Temple period had apparently given way to a much more uniform textual tradition relatively quickly after the Jerusalem temple's destruction. The En-Gedi scroll provides concrete manuscript evidence for that standardization process happening earlier than we had direct proof of before. It rewrote the timeline, challenged assumptions, and showed that even when we think we understand ancient history, a single charred scroll can still surprise us. The revolution spreading across the ancient world. When the burned scroll from En-Gedi finally yielded its words, it did more than solve a single archaeological mystery. It shattered an assumption that had ruled historical research for centuries, that once a manuscript was burned, crushed, or carbonized, its contents were lost forever. If a lump of charcoal from a 6th century synagogue could be read using advanced imaging and artificial intelligence, then an unsettling question followed: how many other hopeless artifacts are sitting unread in museum vaults right now? The answer is unfolding in Italy, at the foot of Mount Vesuvius. What makes this moment extraordinary is not just the recovered texts, it's the shift in possibility. For most of human history, fire meant erasure. Once a manuscript burned, its knowledge vanished. Now, advanced imaging can see what eyes cannot, and AI can detect patterns human cognition would miss. Virtual unwrapping retrieves information without destroying what remains. Destruction is no longer final. The En-Gedi scroll proves the point. For nearly 2,000 years, its words survived in microscopic traces of ink embedded in carbonized animal skin. For 14 centuries, it was physically unreadable. For 40 years, it sat untouched in a vault. Everyone who saw it assumed it was dead. It wasn't. It was waiting. And it's not alone. Across the world, damaged manuscripts sit forgotten in collections. Burned synagogue scrolls, carbonized Egyptian papyri, palimpsests scraped and overwritten, corroded metal texts, water-damaged codices written off decades ago as too fragile to study. Each one may now be recoverable. Each could contain a lost work, a new version of a known text, or an entirely unknown voice from the ancient world. What's happening at Herculaneum and En-Gedi isn't just technological progress, it's a redefinition of loss. We're learning that history doesn't disappear, it hides. And for the first time, we finally have the tools to go looking. History doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it waits in silence, burned and forgotten, until the moment we're capable of listening again. What was once reduced to ash can now speak in fragments of light and code, reminding us that the past isn't gone, it's merely unfinished. As technology sharpens and curiosity refuses to slow, the boundary between what is lost and what can be recovered keeps collapsing. If a scroll destroyed by fire could survive long enough to tell its story, how many other voices are still hidden in the dark, waiting for the day they change everything we think we know?